guys. Welcome to Man Medicine, where we talk about how men can optimize their health and escape the collapsing U.S. healthcare system. Well, today we're going to talk about kind of a not sexy topic, but we're going to talk about niacin, specifically niacin to treat high cholesterol, high LDL, high triglycerides, etc. And I wanted to do this because I've seen a little bit of an uptick on social media of, with various influencers and pseudo-medical people like chiropractors, naturopaths, etc., starting to advocate again for using niacin first line as a quote natural cholesterol remedy. So I'm going to dive into that a little bit, talk to you guys about why niacin is really not terribly effective, why it hardly gets used at all anymore, and why, unfortunately, I stopped taking it after years of taking it, and even after years of prescribing it for patients many, many years ago when I was in full-time primary care. I have stopped doing that because of some of the research that I'm going to share with you guys here today. So I just want you to be more informed if you decide to use niacin, either prescription or the over-the-counter versions. Then at least you'll have this information. You can make a better decision. So anyway, niacin has been used or was used for decades. It still gets used a little bit, primarily because it makes the numbers a lot better. Like all of the numbers that you care about on a lipid panel seem to improve when you take niacin. So this is a chart here showing some of the average changes. Now this is niacin monotherapy. So niacin not with a statin, not with a fibrate, not with any other lipid lowering agents. This is just niacin itself, dosed at 2 grams per day, extended release version. So as you can see here, I mean, you get like up to a 20% reduction in LDL-C, okay? Not too shabby, right? I've seen better improvements in certain individuals, but this is about average. The HDL-C goes up 15 to 35%. And this was one of the big selling points of niacin back in the day. It's like, what do we do with these people with low HDL? They're like, there's no drug we can use that really significantly improves HDL. Statins will a little bit, fibrates, et cetera, but niacin had the biggest effect on improving that number. As we'll talk about, that kind of becomes irrelevant because what we've seen with niacin for the most part, with some exceptions, is that there's no real benefit to raising HDL artificially like this. There actually may be some downsides. It was really good at lowering triglycerides. So a lot of people, especially with diabetes, prediabetes, were running around with high triglycerides. So you could get up to like a 20 to 40% reduction in triglycerides, which was pretty nice. The reason that I took it, I think I've mentioned this before, was not because I have a high LDL or high triglycerides. Like those actually naturally have been very low for me, but I have high lipoprotein A, which if you watch some of the other content that I've put out, and other physicians have done this too, you'll know that Lp(a) is a super atherogenic ApoB containing particle. It's strongly associated with a development of early atherosclerosis, stroke, and a number of other bad things. Very difficult to lower with pharmaceutical interventions, although we do have some things available now and some things in the pipeline. But niacin was one of the few agents, especially at the higher doses, like 1 to 2 grams per day, that could put a dent in your Lp(a). So that's why I took it for a number of years back in the day. So anyways, you can see there, like all the numbers get better when you take niacin. So it was commonly stacked on with a statin. So people would be on a statin and maybe they wouldn't be at their goal for LDL, or they needed just a little bit of, additional assistance to perhaps like raise their HDL. We thought that would make a difference back in the day. And there seemed to be like some synergy in terms of the numbers. So this one, for example, here, New England Journal of Medicine, this article, this is the HATS trial from 2001. So HDL, these are people already on simvastatin. They put them on niacin, extended release. HDL went up 26%, triglycerides down 30%, and they had a combined, with the two drugs, drop in the LDL of 42%, which is pretty decent. So it really made the numbers look a heck of a lot better. Now, how does it work? I'm not going to go too deep into the nitty-gritty of the mechanism, but the niacin blocks free fatty acid delivery or free fatty acid release into the bloodstream from fat cells, and so the downstream effect of that is like you have less substrate for triglycerides and for VLDL, which downstream means if you have less VLDL, you're going to get less LDL. going to see an increase in HDL-C, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, why that is not such a big deal. It's actually a bit. The other interesting thing about niacin is it lowers PCSK9 levels. So there's a lot of talk about PCSK9 inhibitors these days, drugs like Repatha and Glycerin, et cetera. Well, there's some interaction with niacin and PCSK9, and so that might be part of the reason that it makes these numbers look better. So the problem with niacin, unfortunately, is the side effects, and they can be pretty brutal. I mean, I experienced these myself on many, many occasions, and the thing that makes it intolerable for so many people is the flushing. I remember the first couple times I took extended release niacin, I was on Niaspan, which is one of the prescription brands, and oh my God, I mean, I broke out in I was like bright red, itchy tomato for like 3 or 4 hours. And I took it at bedtime. And so it would hit me, if I went to bed at 10, like sometime around midnight or 1 in the morning, I would wake up just, absolutely miserable, like covered in this prickly red rash. And this is something that if you stay on niacin, eventually your body attenuates to it. So this has to do with prostaglandin release. Eventually your body adapts to it, but you had to stay on it continuously. So there were a couple of occasions where like I went on a vacation for a week or two and I didn't bring my niacin with me. So when I started back up on it, I had to start all over again. I got the same like really bad, hot prickly rash, just as if I'd never taken it before. So you did have to stay on it to attenuate that effect. And some people advocated taking like a baby aspirin just before your dose. And I did that, and it did help, NSAIDs, mitigate prostaglandin release, et cetera. So it did actually help with this. But this is really, really severe, and it's the number one complaint of patients. And many of them after the first dose would be like, I'm never taking that stuff again. And so it was kind of a battle to get compliance. The other issue, and I actually experienced this a little bit myself, is that especially with the extended release formulations, not so much with the immediate release, but there's some liver toxicity. So like 10 to 20% of people would see their liver enzymes elevate beyond what would be considered an acceptable level, like 2 to 3 times upper limits of normal for AST and ALT. It's almost always at the high dose, like 1,500 or to 2,000 milligrams plus. And I didn't have this when I just took niacin, but there was a short period of time where I took a low dose of a statin on top of those, and my AST and ALT went up significantly, like into the 300s. I was asymptomatic with it, but I happened to check labs, and as soon as I discontinued the statin, everything came back down again. But this can happen with monotherapy too. The other thing that people need to be aware of, I mean, a lot of people that have high triglycerides and have, poorly controlled LDL, but also happen to be diabetic. And so taking niacin can worsen glycemic control. And, it's not terrible, but if you look at some of the studies out there, I mean, it can raise the hemoglobin A1C like 0.3 to 0.5%, which is actually, I mean, that's pretty significant. And depending on where you start, I mean, that could potentially push you over the 6.5% threshold from pre-diabetes to technically full-blown diabetes. So, it's not an insignificant rise in average blood sugars. The AIM High trial, which I'll touch on here recently, that was a little bit lower. Like their hemoglobin A1C average increase was like 0.2%. So, it's nothing to sneeze at, and long term that could be potentially an issue, especially if you stack it with a statin, which could do the same thing. So the other final thing that is a no-no when if you want to take a niacin is if you have a history of gout, so it can raise uric acid levels. And I've seen a number of patients come into the ED that were on niacin, and we're starting to have more gout flares. So they generally have to come off of it at that point. But overall, it's niacin is tough. It has a number of really unpleasant side effects and a lot of potential harm if you stay on it long term. And so the net result is that on average, about 50% of people that are prescribed niacin end up at some point discontinuing it. And it's usually within the first year. And in my personal experience, it's usually within the first 6 months. It's difficult to get people to stay consistent and take niacin just because of the side effects, and mainly the flushing, which is honestly pretty miserable. So So as I alluded to, so there's different formulations of niacin, right? So there is the immediate release, which is absorbed very rapidly. You have to take this multiple times per day, so oftentimes up to 3 times per day. Much more intense flushing with the immediate release. There's an extended release, which is like intermediate, and then a sustained release, which is like a much longer acting formulation. So the prescription one that I took, Niaspan, is an extended release formulation. So these have slightly different properties in terms of side effects and like how they affect lipids. So for example, so here's a chart showing the metabolism of niacin with a single 1,000 milligram dose, and comparing sustained release, extended release, and immediate release. So you can see like the sustained release, the super long acting, it absorbs and it's metabolized at 50 milligrams per hour, so kind of nice and slow. And then you go all the way to immediate release, which is like boom, 500 milligrams per hour. So there's two different metabolic pathways for niacin. Again, it's not that important that you know this, but there's a conjugation pathway and an amidation pathway. And if you go down the conjugation pathway, which is more likely to happen with immediate release, you get a lot more flushing. If you go down the other pathway, the amidation, you get more liver toxicity. So short acting, you get more conjugation pathway, so you get the flushing, and then the longer release kind, you're more likely to go down the other pathway, and while you get less flushing, you potentially have more liver toxicity associated with that, which is shown in this graph here. This is a chart here, just looking at like the number of flushing episodes over time. So going out to 16 weeks, just comparing the immediate release and the extended release. So you can see like major difference, right? So the immediate release, like tons of flushing, and you still get some flushing with extended release, and I'll vouch for that. It can be really unpleasant, but statistically it's quite a bit less as you go out over time. As far as like how these different formulations affect your lipid panels, this chart here kind of tells it all. They're pretty close, right? They're pretty close, but you can see differences here between they're looking here at immediate release and sustained release, so the two ends of the spectrum. Let's look at LDL, for example. We don't have to go through all of these, but sustained release, you're going to get a slightly better LDL reduction than you will with immediate release. Again, you can see it there at 2 months. It ends up being fairly similar, but there's still a subtle difference there as well. You compare that with triglycerides, where with immediate release, you just tend to see lower triglyceride levels than you do with the sustained release. So subtle differences here. So you may want to, if you're going to take niacin, which again, I don't really recommend anymore, then, you may want to adjust your formulation based on your specific issues. If triglycerides are your main issue that you want to address, immediate release might be a slightly better choice. But honestly, they're both going to work. They're both, they're going to be fine. Okay, so I mentioned that niacin just doesn't get prescribed very much anymore, and you'd be hard pressed to find a cardiologist or lipidologist that would reach for niacin. Certainly not first line anymore. It's pretty much been thrown in the wastebasket. And so, what is the reason for that? Well, mainly because of two big trials that came out in, like 2012, 2013 timeframe, that showed that while niacin made the numbers better, it didn't really affect outcomes at all. And there's people that, that argue about these studies and can, say that, it doesn't really mean that. And, we shouldn't be completely throwing away niacin. But these did a lot of damage to niacin's reputation, and the number of niacin prescriptions that were written after these studies came out fell off the cliff. So the first one is this AIM High trial. And so what they looked at was 3,400 patients. Average age was about 64. They all had known cardiovascular disease. They had low HDL, high triglycerides, kind of the perfect patient for niacin. They were already on simvastatin, and some of them were also on ezetimibe or Zetia if their LDL wasn't low enough. So they came into this study already treated, and they came in already with quite low LDLs. So they said, okay, let's add in up to 2 grams of extended release niacin, and we'll see what the numbers do, and then we'll see if we can also lower the number of adverse events that happen to these patients as we track them over time. And yeah, the numbers definitely got better. The HDL went up by 25%, so pretty significant. Triglycerides decreased by 28%. Now, the LDL lowering wasn't that significant, but that's because these guys, they already had really like pretty low LDLs. I think they were in the 60s because they were already on simvastatin or simvastatin plus ezetimibe. So the LDL didn't really go down that much. And, lo and behold, over time, there was no reduction in cardiovascular events, none whatsoever. And there were a number of adverse events related to blood sugar and gout and issues and some liver toxicity as well. So this still wasn't looking good for and then the next one is this HPS2 Thrive study. Here also New England Journal of Medicine, 2014. Effects of extended release niacin with laropiprant, which is an anti-flushing agent that is mixed in to help help mitigate the rash in high-risk patients. And kind of a similar study. They randomized. So this one was randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled, which is what you want to see. Had a lot of patients. It was like over 25,000 patients. Again, also patients that had established cardiovascular disease, or they had a prior stroke, or they had a peripheral arterial disease. So these were high-risk patients, also already on simvastatin plus or minus ezetimibe. And again, they came in with already like pretty good lipid numbers because again, they were already treated. So for these patients, their LDL-C was average was 63 before they got niacin. HDL was 44, triglycerides were 125. So not great in terms of triglycerides, in my opinion, but not terrible. But the other numbers were actually pretty good. And so they added in extended release niacin, 2 grams a day, and they wanted to see what would happen over time. Well, interestingly enough, the LDL went down another 10 points. The HDL went up 6 points, which is what you would expect to see, right? Triglycerides went down 33 points. So again, all of the numbers got better. The primary endpoint, no significant reduction in major adverse cardiac events, nothing. Like the niacin, it made the numbers better. It did not lower the risk of heart attacks one bit. In either of these two studies. So this was pretty damning for extended release niacin, and especially in combination with a statin, because for a long time we were thinking niacin would be a great agent to add in, and people that are especially, these super high risk patients, they're already maxed out on statins and ezetimibe. How do we address like residual risk? Maybe we can add some niacin in there and it'll make a difference. Turns out in these two studies, it made no difference at all. So more recently, the Cochrane Library came out with a summary, and they looked at 23 randomized controlled trials going way back to 1968 all the way up to 2015, and where they followed patients either on niacin monotherapy or on niacin like plus or minus a statin or another drug. Average time that they followed these patients was almost 12 years. I think it was like 11 and a half. And guess what? So it says here, this is a quote, niacin did not reduce the number of deaths, heart attacks, or strokes. Many people, 18% on average, had to stop taking niacin due to its side effects. So this big, large Cochrane review was like, we reviewed all, 23 different studies going back to 1968, and the totality of the data suggests, niacin makes the numbers better, does not reduce events, unfortunately, just like the previous two studies that I mentioned. So, and then finally, just to get up to date a little bit more recently, this is from 2025 Diabetes Care, which is a good journal. So they published like their standards of care for taking care of diabetic patients in 2025. And this is what they have to say here in this bullet point. Statin plus niacin combination therapy has not been shown to provide additional cardiovascular benefit above statin therapy alone. May increase the risk of stroke. There's some evidence for that, and additional side effects, and is generally not recommended. Level A evidence, so very high level of high quality evidence to support that statement. So like this is the main reason why if you go to your doctor, your cardiologist, your lipidologist, and you've got some lipid issues, they're not going to be reaching for niacin. Very unlikely. Now there's still a few holdouts. There's a few outliers out there that still think that there's a role for niacin, but the vast majority of the medical community that treats heart disease, like we've moved on from niacin because there's better alternatives, and the data to support its use and its effectiveness is not great. It's not great. So now I would be remiss and I wouldn't be fair and balanced on this channel if I didn't say that there actually is some data, especially before these particular trials came out, that show that, there are some people that might benefit from using niacin to treat their lipids. And, there were some criticisms of these other trials too, that they said, well, maybe the statin is interfering with the effects of the niacin. In the other study, the second one, they added an anti-flushing agent. So like maybe that had, maybe that interfered with the benefit. Maybe really it's immediate release niacin that's the most effective and not the extended release or no flush niacin. Maybe there's a difference there. And maybe that's true because there are a few studies, I have some of them highlighted here, the CLASS, FATS, and HATS trial, which, did seem to show some benefit in patients that were at higher risk. The interesting thing about these trials, they all used very high doses, so much higher than the 2 grams of the extended release niacin. In some cases, 4.3 grams in the CLASS trial, 4 grams per day total in FATS trial, but it was immediate release, so not extended release. So it had to be divided up multiple times per day. Typically it's dosed like 3 times a day, sometimes twice a day. So, maybe there's a difference if you take immediate release and you take it at much higher dose in certain patient populations, that there potentially could be some benefit. So what patient populations are these? It's hard to know exactly. It seems to be the ones that, the ones with the worst lipids maybe are the ones that seem to benefit the most. This is a table from, I believe, the National Lipid Association, looking at risk ratios and, showing like who are the people that, benefited the most, like in terms of based on their cholesterol. And so what you see is like people with the higher LDLs, those studies seem to show that there maybe was some benefit with niacin. As your LDL went down, and of course your HDL, if you had good HDL, there wasn't any benefit there. So what this seems to show is that patients, essentially, I'll boil this down, essentially patients with the worst types of lipid panels maybe are the ones that benefit. So if you have really high LDL, really low HDL, really out of control triglycerides, perhaps you're more likely to actually get some benefit from niacin than you would if maybe you have borderline lipid issues. There's not consensus on this by any means, but the National Lipid Association considers niacin to be like a 3rd or 4th line agent, so like way down the line, because we just have much better options there. But just to be fair, there are some studies, and you'll hear people say, well, you've got to take the flush niacin. It's the only one that actually works, and there's some soft data to support that. So they're not entirely wrong about that. So. The question is, something that I've been curious about for a long time is like, why does a drug that moves the numbers so favorably across the board, LDL, HDL, triglycerides, ApoB, like all of these things move significantly in the right direction, why would we not see any benefit, or why would we see minimal benefit as we see sometimes with like the immediate release formula? Well, so it turns out there's some interesting things about the way that niacin works in terms of HDL. We used to think that, it raises HDL, so this is going to improve, as a quote, good cholesterol, which you should never call it that. There's no good cholesterol, there's no bad cholesterol, there's just lipoproteins, and they all have different functions. But HDL's job essentially is to extract cholesterol from the periphery and recycle it back into the liver. So it makes sense, if the HDL-C number goes up, we're pulling cholesterol out of the tissues, we're taking it back to the liver, we're getting it recycled, processed, metabolized, etc. So this is called reverse cholesterol transport. Well, what they found was like, even though the HDL-C went up, in some cases by like 29, 30%, you did not see a corresponding rise in reverse cholesterol transport, or cholesterol efflux capacity, they call it. So again, the HDL-C number went up, but we're not seeing more recycling of cholesterol, which is what you would expect to see, right? If you had more HDL-C in action, we should see that. And it turns out that that's not the case. So, what the heck is going on? The bottom line is that niacin doesn't actually raise HDL particle number at all. It makes HDL-C go up, but that's not the same as the HDL P, which is the actual particle number. So if you get a NMR test, you get an actual particle count, you'll see that the number of HDL particles with niacin does not go up. So you're being fooled into thinking your HDL went up. It didn't go up. What went up is actually the size and the cholesterol composition of the actual HDL. So niacin induces like these structural changes within the HDL particle. And so you shift it from small cholesterol poor HDL particles to large cholesterol-rich particles, which is not a good thing because it's actually these small lipid-poor or cholesterol-poor HDLs that are most efficient and most effective in terms of accepting cholesterol and initiating, the whole like reverse cholesterol transport process. So, yeah, so you basically get dysfunctional HDL. You get HDL that is less effective at doing its job. And, HDL serves obviously very important properties. It removes cholesterol from vessel walls. It's anti-inflammatory, as you can see here. It has some anticoagulant properties, perhaps. It's possibly an antioxidant. So, all of these things potentially are compromised when you take high doses and that's a really interesting finding. It's not something that I knew about until, relatively recently, and I had a lipidologist explain it to me. But that HDL-C number going up you're being fooled when you see that. You actually don't have more HDL. So the actual particle number does not go up. So I thought that was pretty interesting. It actually explains a lot of why we're just not seeing like huge benefits with niacin. And then the final thing I will say about this is a paper here in Nature Medicine that got a lot of press back in 2024. A terminal metabolite of niacin promotes vascular inflammation and contributes to cardiovascular disease risk. To boil down this paper, basically, this is somebody has theorized that some of the metabolic breakdown products of niacin actually induce an inflammatory response. They are associated with worsening endothelial dysfunction, release pro-inflammatory cytokines, so like tumor necrosis factor alpha, IL-6. So it does all of these bad things. This mechanism that they're talking about in here, without going into too much detail, probably varies from individual to individual. Likely, it's going to affect people that have certain genetic polymorphisms than perhaps other people. So this maybe doesn't affect everybody, but it is one of the plausible ways to explain, again, why despite these lipid numbers getting so much better, are we not seeing benefit? And why are we actually seeing harm in some of the studies? So like increased strokes in some of these studies when we give people niacin. They should be getting less strokes at the very least, but in some studies they suggest actually they're getting more strokes. So there's a lot more to niacin than just number go down in terms of LDL or number go up in terms of HDL. When you look into the metabolic pathways and what it actually does to these lipoproteins, then now it starts to make sense. This is why niacin is really not certainly not a first, second, or even third line agent, in my opinion, for addressing lipids. So I have stopped taking niacin. Whether you decide to continue taking niacin, if you are or not, is entirely up to you and your doctor. But I don't think generally niacin's, supplementation, especially at like these 2 gram to 4 gram doses, it's largely unnecessary. If you want to supplement with niacin, you can do it at much lower doses. You need about 20 milligrams a day. You can get it from, mainly animal products. Obviously, meats are fantastic sources of niacin. So tuna, chicken, turkey, liver, peanuts, and like sunflower seeds have a fair amount of niacin as well. So your body can make niacin from tryptophan, which is a really important mechanism. So if you have a high protein diet, you're going to be making plenty of niacin as well. Tryptophan also, by the way, is important for serotonin production. So there's a relationship there. If you have a low tryptophan diet, you may end up making niacin at the expense of serotonin, which could have some neuropsychiatric effects potentially. So be careful, with that. It's generally not a problem in the Western world. Niacin deficiency is extremely rare in the Western world. I've only ever seen it on board exams. I've never actually seen it in real life. It's a condition called pellagra. So anyway, you can read about that if you want to. So anyway, high protein foods usually will get you plenty of niacin. So what do you do? I mean, if you have low HDL, back in the day, it'd be like, hey man, take some niacin. you know, there's no good pharmacological ways to raise HDL per se. And it's even questionable whether you need to worry about that. HDL often, when it's low, is a marker of something else that you need to work on, which is usually like metabolic dysfunction, insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia. Smoking is a huge one. So, if you want to raise it naturally, so regular aerobic exercise, you can get it up like 15% in some cases. Weight loss is huge. You can raise HDL by, some people say, up to 20%. Okay, if you're obese, you need to get the body fat off. That will raise your HDL. Eating lots of mono and polyunsaturated fats, you can get a little boost there, like 5 or 10% in some cases. I mentioned smoking cessation. Smoking just wrecks your HDL. So there's a lot of reasons to quit smoking, but that's, you can just add that one to the list as well. And obviously, for you guys out there that are using androgens, high doses, certainly high supraphysiologic doses of androgens, especially synthetics, DHT-derived androgens especially, will tank HDL. SARMs are notorious for doing this. The only times I've ever seen like single-digit HDLs are with SARMs and drugs like Winstrol, as well. So, those are drugs you should be avoiding for other reasons as well, but just one more reason to do that. Low carb or ketogenic diets will raise HDL as well, but often at the expense sometimes of elevated ApoB, which can be a bit of a concern. So those are the ways that, if you feel like you need to raise your HDL, that's the way you go about it. And, niacin, unfortunately, is just, is not going to do it for you. So anyway, just to wrap things up, guys, I used to take niacin. I don't anymore because the overwhelming bulk of the evidence shows there's really no benefit to taking it. Again, the numbers get better, but whether it actually reduces cardiovascular events, which is what I'm interested in for myself and for my patients, highly, highly unlikely at this point. If you want to take it or you're taking it for other reasons other than cardiovascular protection, by all means, that's on you. But just be aware that, you might be giving yourself a bit of a false sense of security if you're taking niacin to bring your LDL down, your HDL up, triglycerides down, et cetera, and you think that that's giving you additional cardiovascular protection. The data would say that's probably not the case. So, these days there's so many better alternatives to niacin that, I just really don't see a place for it in terms of cardiovascular disease prevention, risk reduction, et cetera. Statins work, and there's a lot of people out there that have irrational fear and dislike of statins. They're effective. Whether you want to take one or not is entirely up to you. Ezetimibe is a good drug as well. Bempedoic acid, the PCSK9 inhibitors, high-dose omega-3 fatty acids are fairly effective for reducing triglycerides, especially like Lovaza and what's the other one, Vascepa, the prescription, Cadillac fish oils. If your insurance will pay for it, can be effective. If you want to do other supplements, there's things like berberine and pantethine, which will also make those numbers better. About the supplements, though, I will say that berberine and pantethine, for example, are like the most well-known ones. Very well could be the same situation as with niacin, meaning that the numbers get better, but we don't know if it reduces cardiovascular events. I've never seen a single study on pantethine, and I'm not aware of any with berberine that are good, double-blind placebo-controlled studies where they've significantly reduced cardiovascular events. If you're aware of one, please let me know. But it will make the numbers look better. And both of those are considered pretty safe. Pantethine is, vitamin B5 derivative. So it's, essentially water-soluble vitamin. So it's very, very benign. It's kind of hard to overdose on that. There's no known toxicity that I'm aware of. So anyway, guys, that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you're taking niacin and you've had good or bad experiences with it, let me know in the comments because I always like to hear from you guys. I will catch you next time. Bye-bye.
All Man Medicine video and audio has been created and shared online for informational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute the practice of medicine or professional healthcare services of any kind, including the giving of medical advice. I am not your doctor. No doctor-patient relationship has been established. This content is not meant to be a substitute for professional medical advice and should not be relied upon solely for that purpose either. The only purpose of this content is to present peer-reviewed, research-backed health information for your consideration. As always, rely on the advice and guidance of your personal physician before undertaking any activity presented here, and if in doubt or not comfortable with said activity, Practice discretion. Your health is your responsibility and not ours. Finally, I take conflicts of interest seriously. I accept no compensation whatsoever from any private corporations, including pharmaceutical or supplement companies. You can trust that if I recommend a medication, product, or service, it's because I genuinely believe in it and not because I'm being paid to endorse it.